Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. My name is Bhaskar Sankar, and I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine. And almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern, I've been joined by a left-wing thinker who's been talking about an idea for around a half an hour. And then we've been doing a brief Q&A afterwards. And if you want to join the Q&A, all you need to do is log into YouTube and leave questions, leave answers in the chat, or just the questions. We'll provide the answers. Or hopefully. And this week we have a really good lineup. Tomorrow we have Anton Jaeger, one of my favorite young left-wing intellectuals. He's a scholar of populism, and he'll be talking about the left populist surge in Europe, why it fizzled out, or largely has fizzled out. I'm sure we're going to get a few Podemos fans who are going to send me an angry note about that one. And what happens next? Where do we go from here? Then after that, on Friday, we have Leah Ippy, who's going to be talking about John Rawls's theory of justice and its relationship with socialism. So what does the most radical, most egalitarian forms of liberalism, to what extent do they already embody some features of thought that we would consider socialist, and what are they missing in their critique of capitalism? And then obviously every Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. They have a show with us called Weekends. This week, their guest is Glenn Greenwald. So today we have another fine guest. Daniel Bessner is a professor, associate professor, I think, at the associate professor at the University of Washington. And he's also a contributing editor at Jacobin. He's one of the smartest people on the left writing about the difficult question of the left and its orientation towards foreign policy. Because obviously, we're internationalists and we're radicals. So often when we talk about foreign policy, it's just reduced to a purely idealistic sloganeering. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's something profoundly noble about the American left and its stance against imperialism, its call for internationalism. I myself still look forward to the day when we could sing the Internationale in Esperanto, and where there's red flags everywhere instead of national flags across the world. But now that we actually have big insurgent campaigns like the Bernie Sanders campaign, now that we have figures like AOC, Rashida, Ilhan Omar, and others in office, we actually have to think about what are our concrete asks of our elected officials? What is this movement actually going to demand as an opposition in the here and now within actually existing capitalist America? And I think Danny's going to have some really great answers for us tonight. Before I pass it off to him, though, I just want to remind you, obviously, we're doing this all for free. We have been getting great help from our producer, Cale Brooks. A lot of time and effort is going into this series, which will be around for years and years to come on YouTube. So we're really we're excited by the response. Our subscriber base for this our YouTube channel has gone from around 4,000 to basically 22,000 in a little bit over a month. So the response has been great. But our only ask of you is to press like and press subscribe. By doing so, you allow us to reach more and more people. And that's obviously our purpose, to propagandize and to take these debates from just a cloistered few, just a handful of people on the existing left, and to the many millions of working people that we know in the future will be engaging in these conversations and reshaping the world around them. So please press like, please press subscribe. If you have questions, please put them into the chat, and I'll pass it off now.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity for being asked to come and give this lecture. A fun little fact, I believe Esperanto was George Soros's first language, and Soros was actually, his father was an Esperantist, and Soros is actually a palindrome which is why his father had a different name. It was a Jewish name like Cohen or something like that, and they changed it to Soros, but just a fun fact. So thank you again. And before I'd like to begin, I'd also like to thank everyone for tuning into this lecture and to express my hope that you and yours are surviving the pandemic well and that you're not being sacrificed to the blood of capitalism by being forced to work, even though I'm sure many of you are, and I apologize on behalf of capitalism, I guess, for that. It's clear that we reached one of those rare moments in history when, as the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci remarked, the old is dying and the new cannot be born, or at least has not been born yet. One can only hope that we socialists will emerge from the latest in the series of capitalist crises, reaffirmed not only in our beliefs, but in our convictions that we can and should change the world. And one of the major things that socialists must focus on combating, defeating, and transcending, I'd like to argue in this lecture today, is the American empire. And to understand where we are, we must understand where we've been. In 1945, the United States emerged victorious in World War II as, I would argue, the world's sole superpower. It far outpaced its closest rivals, the Soviet Union and Great Britain, in terms of its military, economic, and soon to be cultural power. It's not an exaggeration to say that the United States began in 1945 and has continued since then, setting the terms of world politics. And the United States knew from pretty early on that it was the world's prime nation. Contrary to what many in the foreign policy establishment, which is also sometimes known as the blob, and which simply refers to the elites who work in think tanks, academic research centers, and the government itself and who make foreign policy, US behavior throughout the 20th century was rapacious. To summarize in brief, in the late 1940s, US policymakers decided to construct a world order based not on liberal principles of cooperation, but on imperial principles of military, economic, and cultural primacy. In the process, Americans repeatedly intervened in the politics of foreign countries, distorting organic developments and creating conditions that engendered mass death and displacement worldwide. As the political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke has shown, during the Cold War, the period from 1947 to 1989, the United States attempted to covertly overthrow foreign regimes 64 times, and in 44 of those cases supported authoritarian forces, which led to numerous civil wars and instances of mass killing. Indeed, the historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain has argued persuasively that more than 20 million people perished in the Cold War era conflicts like the Vietnam War, an average of more than 1,200 people a day for 45 years. And in my opinion, it was the United States far more than the Soviet Union that made the Cold War what it was, and we could talk about that in discussion. It was also during this long 4-decade period that the United States created its enormous system of about 800 overseas bases, in some instances even directly taking over former United Kingdom bases that Great Britain was forced to surrender as a part of deals made during World War II. It was this system that enabled the United States to become what some historians have called a pointless empire. And you can see the map system, system of bases on a map on your screens right now. And as the historian Daniel Immerwahr has recently described, these hundreds of US bases around the globe, quote, serve as staging grounds, launch pads, storage sites, beacons, and laboratories, end quote, for the American empire. I would add that these bases also function as constant reminders to powers both great and small, from Russia to China to Iran to Indonesia to Zimbabwe, that the United States has the capacity to annihilate any nation should it do anything that the United States considers unconscionable or significantly against its interests, and interests mostly defined by the capitalist elite. As this suggests, it's not an exaggeration to say that the United States is the only nation in the world to truly have the ability to exercise sovereignty, as it's the only nation in the world that is constantly forcing the destruction of everyone else. It's for this reason that, for instance, in 2017, the United States had special operations forces deployed to 149 countries, about 75% of the nations in the entire world. There's only one truly free nation on the globe, and that nation is the United States. In addition to the already extant system of overseas bases, the United States maintains its colossal power by spending an enormous amount on its military. In mid-December 2019, the US Congress approved a federal defense budget that will expend about $738 billion in 2020, which is about $20 billion more than was spent in 2019. In fact, 40 million of these funds will go to creating a sixth armed service, the Space Force. In comparative perspective, this means that the United States spends more than the next 7 countries, China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Germany, combined on its military, as you could see on that defense spending chart. In fact, in 2018, these 7 countries spent a total of $609 billion on their military forces, less than the United States spent by itself. The American empire, I would also argue, is not only undergirded by these material realities, but by the large contingent of people in Washington, D.C., who want the empire to continue. I referred to them earlier in this talk as the foreign policy establishment, or the blob. But a more analytical way to refer to this group is as the military intellectual complex. If the military industrial complex builds the weapons of American empire, and we've all heard of that, then the military intellectual complex develops the concepts that determine where such weapons are actually used. Now, the overwhelming majority of people who navigate the military intellectual complex, who make their careers in it, believe that world peace and prosperity depends on the United States. The story that these people tell about the 20th century is very different from the one I just told. According to members of the blob, in the mid-1940s, policymakers correctly concluded that international peace and prosperity depended on the United States. And I'm quoting here from a book called The Empty Throne, which was written by 2 blob members. So they believe that peace and prosperity depended on the United States, quote, advancing collective security, opening free markets, and promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, end quote, throughout the globe. To accomplish these goals, members of the blob believe that decision makers, quote, created a system based on the logic of cooperation. Countries willing to follow America's lead would flourish, and as they did, so too would the United States, end quote. Well, the members of the blob do admit that this world order had its problems. For example, they say it only applied to the West. The United Nations and other international organizations were never actually that powerful, that human rights were often sacrificed for reasons of political expediency, and some mistakes, like, for example, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba or the Vietnam War, were made. On balance, people in the blob believe that it was a historic success that ended real major wars throughout the world. And in fact, this is a really powerful story because it makes the United States the unquestioned good guy in international relations. And I'd argue that this is a story that most Americans, who understandably don't spend that much time thinking about foreign policy or the history of the United States as empire, believe. Or it's a story that they want to believe and therefore kind of do, at least implicitly. So this all suggests that if socialists desire to transform how the United States interacts in the world, they'll need to combat at one and the same time the material and ideological basis of US empire. We not only have to destroy the military industrial complex, we also have to destroy the military intellectual complex, and we have to persuade a mass of Americans that the power that their nation enjoys in the world rests on a rapacious imperialism, destruction, and deracination. Personally, I really do believe that this could actually be accomplished. If anything, the last 20 years of US foreign policy, in which the United States lurched from one disaster to another in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Libya, makes it more likely, I think at least, that ordinary Americans are willing to listen to an anti-imperialist and anti-militarist message. I'd like to mention one more obstacle that I think stands in the way of transforming how the United States interacts in the world. The simple fact that most Americans don't fully appreciate the disastrous consequences that come as the result of US imperial action. So why is this the case? There's a story I just told, of this very powerful story about the US being the good guy, but there's also this issue. So in 1973, US elites decided to create what has been termed the all-volunteer force. That is to say, in the wake of the Vietnam disaster, which spurred famously significant anti-war protests undertaken by the New Left and associated groups, military and political leaders decided that only Americans who consciously chose to fight for the United States would do so. Though many left-wing Americans at the time celebrated the effective ending of the military draft, from the perspective of 2020, we can see that the all-volunteer force enabled the United States to continue to intervene in the world, only now the majority of Americans were shielded from the consequences of these interventions. And I'd argue that the last 50 years has really witnessed a cleaning of American military action in the world, basically culminating in the use of drone strikes, where Americans are totally shielded from the effects of these weapons of death and destruction. So That's a really important element to appreciating why there isn't really this anti-militarist, anti-imperialist feeling amongst so many Americans, maybe a bit post-Iraq. Um, Furthermore, and this might be a bit controversial, the all-volunteer force, which took from a very particular portion of society, particularly the enlisted class, became totally elite. It was already elite, but even more elite. The all-volunteer force prevented soldiers themselves from being exposed to left-wing ideas, and the military, already a conservative institution, became even more right-wing. So, if socialists hope to transform US foreign policy, they must understand that the military is a site of struggle, and in particular, we really must ally with left wing veterans who understand more than most the vicious consequences of American empire. And Jacobin has done a lot to further that project, I think. So, now, before describing how I believe can begin building power for foreign policymaking, I'd like to highlight just one example of how powerful the United States remains in today's world. So, we've all read reports or seen TV shows and broadcasts showing, for example, that Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, or Justin Trudeau like to mock Trump for his unpredictability. And despite their lack of respect for Trump, though, we also regularly see how none of these leaders have expressed the power or will to even attempt to break with the United States on any really significant issue. So, in the final analysis, I like to think that Trump's presidency reveals that the United States can be led by a despised fool, and that this just doesn't matter very much for America's global position. And so, why am I saying that? So, simply put, I'd like to argue that though we've seen a lot of hand wringing about the decline of U.S. power, um, particularly after Trump's election to the presidency, I do think that the United States looks set to maintain its global military primacy for years to come, and one might add economic primacy as well. This is a problem that we who want to dismantle empire must directly confront. American power does not rely on moral supremacy. Instead, it relies on a military supremacy, the likes of which has never before been seen in history. How do we deconstruct the US military machine? How do we transform a society and culture that encourages militarism? These are the questions that must occupy socialist critics in the new decade and coming decades and beyond. Otherwise, I think the status quo will remain unchanged. So this brings us to the question: is how do we begin to transform U.S. foreign policy? The first step, and this might be a bit unpopular, is to win a presidential election. Since the United States became the world hegemon in 1945, foreign policy making in this country has been concentrated and ever more concentrated in the White House. And despite a brief attempt to reassert its foreign policy powers in the 70s, the US Congress has largely abandoned its role in war making, although this is beginning to change with Bernie's resolution on Yemen, and particularly Bernie and Ro Khanna and some others really trying to bring the US Congress back to the fore. One might also mention, as Bhaskar did, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and AOC, to some degree, have also attempted to do this. Nevertheless, despite these actions, I'd still argue that the American president is the primary decision maker when it comes to foreign policy, and socialists will be unlikely to make any revolutionary transformations unless we actually win a presidential election. And this, as far as I can tell, is an uncomfortable reality that I think we need to appreciate and accept. Second, a socialist project for foreign policy must be an educational project. One of the most important things to do is persuade Americans that only a very small number of people in this country and throughout the world actually benefit from the American empire. To accomplish this, we'll need to think creatively. So, to take just one project I've been mulling over in recent years, I believe socialists should make a concerted effort to, for example, transform American textbooks. Why do people who attend American public schools learn so little about what their nation has done in the world in the last 70 years? In fact, I'd argue that this ignoring is part of a long tradition of Americans turning their gaze away from the empire that structures their and other lives in the world. And it's this unseeing that must be undone. We should also, of course, work with unions and other groups to make political education, and especially foreign policy education, part of what it means to belong to a union. The SEIU and other major unions should have a foreign policy position, which could also be used to build connections with left wing movements throughout the world. Third, as my last point suggests, we socialists need to build strong connections with democratic and left wing movements abroad. This is, of course, already being done, but we need to put even more focus on it. In my opinion, socialism as a movement is inherently skeptical of national borders, even if we appreciate, as I do, the fact that in the modern world, in the world of 2020, socialist transformation is likely to be enacted through the mechanism of the nation state. Thus, despite the importance of seizing national power, we must always build and retain connections with both the international workers' movement and other nationally based workers' groups. Fourth, we need to build left wing institutions. For decades, the social democratic left has essentially abandoned the military intellectual complex to the center and the right wing. Whereas these political tendencies have groups like the American Enterprise Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, and many more, the anti militarist tendency has largely been confined to the libertarian Cato Institute. Happily, this is changing as represented in the founding of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And just to say, full disclosure, I'm a fellow, a non-resident fellow there. But this group is important because it's dedicated to combating the primacist assumptions of the blog. But I also think that as socialists, we should continue to not only support such militarist and anti-imperialist organizations, but should in fact, in time, create our own that are able to work within the military intellectual complex. Fifth, I think we must be careful to connect whatever socialist presidential administration and whatever anti-militarist organizations that are founded to the grassroots. So for decades at this point, U.S. foreign policy has been determined by the so-called best and the brightest, which the multitude of U.S. foreign policy disasters suggests are anything but the best and the brightest. In 2020, there's no reason to claim that experts should be allowed to make foreign policy without seriously considering American public opinion. And when considering American public opinion, and I would add, we could get into this in the talk, also global public opinion and what that means. But let's focus on America for now. When considering American public opinion, experts should be forced to look to socialist groups, unions, reading groups, the DSA, what have you, which should all develop coherent foreign policy positions. So whenever the United States looks set to do something in the world, socialists should be able to provide their own opinions on the matter. Put another way, socialists need to develop mechanisms that consciously connect the grassroots to the elite and which prevent foreign policy from being a sphere of action in which only the powerful have any significant say. Sixth, and finally, as I suggested above, socialists must make a concerted effort to spread their anti-imperialist and anti-militarist message among those who enlist in the military and especially among veterans. The military has an outsized role in American political life, and I would say military ideas have an outsized role in American political culture, and is further itself a very important maker of US foreign policy. So, stated dramatically, but I think correctly, an anti imperialist and anti militarist message will unlikely be embraced by the mass of Americans unless some military representatives themselves publicly support it. And to conclude this talk, I'd like to briefly mention the principles that I believe must undergird a working class or socialist foreign policy. And then I look forward to taking your questions. So, the first principle that I think we need to stress is democracy. Socialist politics is, at its heart, in my opinion at least, about giving power to ordinary people. And as socialists, we must consider what ordinary Americans think about the United States' role in the world. But, and in my opinion, this is just as important, we must also seriously consider what people abroad think about US foreign policy or what the US should do in the world. One of the most exciting things about the way Bernie Sanders discussed foreign policy throughout his campaign was that he centered not only Americans, but everyone in the world, Malaysian workers, Syrian refugees, and many other people. This must, I think, be the foundation of a socialist foreign policy, not just to center Americans, but to center everyone. Second, we must stress accountability. If a socialist wins the presidency, they must prosecute Americans who violated international law and committed war crimes. They must also make sure that those who contributed to disastrous foreign policies in the past are unable to exercise influence in the future. Beyond this, as a movement, I think we should criticize media companies that, for example, allow Iraq war cheerleaders to retain their prominent perches as columnists or talking heads, in the sense that we should work as much as possible to make accountability a cultural norm, a really significant thing. And because without accountability, I think no change is possible. Third, we've got to emphasize anti-militarism and anti-imperialism. Stated simply, we should make very clear that we believe it's only legitimate to use military force if the very existence of the United States is threatened. We should thus, of course, not support invasions like those of Iraq against Iraq and Afghanistan. And this might be a bit more controversial, I also think we shouldn't support humanitarian interventions to save threatened populations. Why shouldn't we save populations that are threatened? In my opinion, the United States will only be able to save threatened populations if we maintain the military ability to do so. And if we maintain the military ability to do so, the American empire will continue. And so this is, I think, is a difficult choice that we have to make. Fourth, we've got to emphasize threat deflation. We should state clearly and without apology that, in our opinion, US troops can be brought home and US bases can be dismantled because the United States doesn't face any serious threats. North Korea, Iran, the Islamic State, Russia, and China can't challenge American sovereignty in the ways that Nazi Germany was able to do in the past. We're very safe and we should act like it, and this should become a socialist message. Finally, and to echo what Bhaskar said when he introduced the talk itself, we must full throatingly endorse internationalism. As I stated earlier in this talk, in my opinion, socialism seeks to destroy all barriers that separate human beings from each other. We should not only eliminate class divisions, but also, of course, racial, gender, and yes, national divisions. Our project must necessarily be, at least in its utopian form, if not in its practical strategic form, it must be internationalist. And we should never abandon this internationalism either in theory or in practice. In terms of specific actions, our internationalism should take the form of joining international treaties and institutions embraced by most nations, like the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the International Criminal Court, and also building the connections with left wing and democratic movements throughout the world, both at the elite and grassroots levels. It also means that we should emphasize that diplomacy is the most important way to prevent wars from occurring. And we should also pursue the international disarmament, and particularly disarmament of nuclear weapons, upon which global peace will rest. So that is to say, I am done. And I hope I've given you all a bit to chew on. Thanks again for tuning in. And I really look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot. I really they covered a lot of ground very concisely, which is what we always want with these. There's a bunch of questions, or some questions already in. So if you want to add more, please add them to the chat. In the meantime, press like, press subscribe. We have a really good lineup for the rest of the week. We have Anton Yeager tomorrow on populism. Then on Friday, we have Leah Ippy on John Rawls and socialism and its sometimes tense relationship with socialism, which I'm looking forward to. But obviously, I'm a niche audience. So hopefully someone else will be tuning in for that one. So let me just start with the one of the questions that came in. Okay, so one of them is a question of how can we tie fights for big social democratic programs like Medicare for all, or for the building of domestic infrastructure, um, with the fight against imperialism. So obviously, part of it is just rhetorical. In a nice way, we always say, well, if we weren't spending money on war, we could build schools. And obviously, the math doesn't really work out. Like our welfare state demands are so expansive that you could drain the military budget to zero, and it wouldn't really make that much of a difference in what we want to do. But it's very good rhetoric. I'm merely saying that, not that the military budget shouldn't be reduced radically. What I'm saying is just, a proper welfare state is actually pretty expensive. So I guess how can we draw a direct connection between the two? And I guess the key point here underlying it is we obviously want to make clear to people that from the working class, we're not demanding sacrifices from ordinary people on the altar of an abstract internationalism, but in fact, it goes hand in hand with their fight for day to day, struggle or
Yeah,
improvement.
I think that's a really important question. And one thing to do is to just emphasize that for example, defense contractors that comprise the military industrial complex are themselves part of the larger capitalist political economy that like Lockheed and Boeing, Northrop, and other companies, like other capitalist organizations, basically make their money off of government funds and oftentimes through corruption. For example, the famous F-35, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, probably at this point, let's say hundreds of millions of dollars all told, and will never fly and will never be deployed in war. So it's part of the broader corruption of capitalism, the critique of imperialism. I also think that we need to emphasize that who suffers in imperial misadventures, it is the working class who signs up for the American military. It's people who generally don't have other options, generally in the South. And there's a bit of conflicting data on who exactly signs up for it, but it does seem to be that people are generally below the median income, and they therefore suffer in sort of American imperial misadventures, come back here and have poor health insurance from the VA and what have you. But I also think that frankly, and Bhaskar, as you I think implied, it's that we need to start thinking creatively. So one thing that might that I've thought about is, why don't we tie things like refugee resettlement programs to jobs creation programs in the United States? There's a lot of poor areas of this country where that have been deindustrialized, that have been deservicized, what have you. But it's nevertheless a big country, and so why don't we help resettle Syrian refugees here and tie that to a jobs program for helping people resettle or something along those lines? Maybe that's a bad idea, maybe it's a good idea, but I think this just suggests that we need to begin to think creatively about how to tie the American imperialist project abroad to what's going on here at home. Finally, I think it's very clear that these things are tied together because, as we see in the pandemic response, right, like things cross borders, viruses cross borders, capital crosses borders. The effects of American military empire abroad come to inform how the police act here at home. So I think drawing those connections, not only rhetorically, but making very clear how this affects working people's lived experiences, will be a crucial way to connect these two spheres.
So someone in the comments brings up a Penny Lewis book. I think probably referring to that book that's like Hard Hats, Hippies, and Hawks, which talks
Mhm.
about public support for the Vietnam War. And I haven't read it in a very long time, but I think the main thesis, the main point was that support for the Vietnam War was actually most prominent among people who had postgraduate education or college education, and the working class, using kind of education as a proxy for class, was actually consistently opposed to the war. And obviously, that trend has continued in a certain way with opposition to things like the Iraq War. Like in my family debates, it's funny because most of my family is kind of a big West Indian kind of working class family, and they will have dinner table arguments. It will be like, well, Bush. I will not do a Trinidadian accent on this Zoom. I thought about it, but I'm like, no, it's now going on YouTube. It'll be archived. So a lot of it will be like, Bush invaded Iraq to make money for Halliburton, right? Or it was a war for oil. And in a way, that's a place where mass sentiment is like hyper materialist. It's probably a bit too directly materialist. It's a bit
Yeah,
too reductionist.
it's more than that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it is a common sentiment. But would you agree that the American people, at least post Vietnam or post Cold War, are at a
I
point
think,
where the knee jerk sentiment is in fact, at the very least, an anti-interventionist, isolationist
yeah,
sentiment?
I would say the broad swath of American people don't want the United States to get involved in ground wars where one uses troops. I would say there's much less of resistance to using drones, things like that. And I think that is broadly true. I would say that's accurate, but I don't think that's really how the American empire functions today. It's not. We don't have 55 Iraqs, right? It's much more of a subtle maneuvering of the global political economy, of the having of these bases, of using quote unquote precision strikes, and hiding militarism from the American people. And the project, I think, if we're talking about how to broaden this out, and this is, I think, the project of socialism. It's basically how to make one group of people empathize with another group of people to which they're not immediately in their day-to-day lives directly connected, even though they're connected via structure. And that's a very difficult task. And this is why I think we socialists have to be, not just attack the material, which is important, but also the ideology that undergirds American actions in the world. And I would say this is going to be a tough task because I think that the sort of like ultimate base ideology goes back to the founding of the republic, and even before, of the Christian millenarianism, which is that the United States is a city upon a hill that needs to sort of spread its light throughout the world. And this has at times transmogrified into an American interventionism. I would say liberalism is an interventionist ideology that emerges from that Christian millenarianism. So it's a tough task that we just need to take seriously and think creatively about, like textbooks or something like that.
So there is a question that might take us a little bit off track, but I think it's an interesting one. So I'm going to ask you to put on your diplomatic historian hat, which is it's a question about Soviet foreign policy. And first of all, I think we are of the view that the Soviet foreign policy was largely defensive. So Stalin, immediately after the Cold War, obviously wants to secure a buffer in Eastern Europe, and for very obvious reasons. The country had just been invaded twice. Both the massive foreign invasions and the attempt to kind of scoop up the territory of the western part of the Russian Empire after the Bolshevik takeover during the Russian Civil War. Then obviously the Nazi invasion. So trying to create those satellite states as buffers. but otherwise is pretty conservative, pretty defensive. So doesn't encourage partisans to take power in France, where they probably wouldn't have been able to take power, in Italy, where maybe they would have been able to take power. Didn't really send aid to the Greek partisans. You know, that the aid
We
flowing into
didn't. No.
them was going mostly from Tito and the Yugoslavs, but in general was not definitely trying to foment world revolution, um, outside of the people's democracy kind of satellite states, um, Korean War, whatnot. So in general, Soviet foreign policy was fairly conservative. I think we would agree with that premise. So did the U.S. misinterpret Soviet foreign policy, or was it cynically using the language of containment to push its own interest? Or maybe it's neither, and they just were interpreting domestic class struggle and national liberation movements with Soviet kind of meddling, even when it wasn't. So I guess there's that question about the Cold War and the U.S. What the foreign policy establishment was thinking in the U.S.
Sure. I think it's a mixture of both. So I think very early on in World War II, and just to shout out Stephen Wertheim's first forthcoming book, Tomorrow the World, this essentially makes this argument in to one degree or another. Basically, after the fall of France in 1940, U.S. elites in the government and without the government but connected to the government decided that world peace again and prosperity would depend on American military primacy. So that is very early on, even before the United States enters World War II. There's the belief that the United States kind of has to take things over at this point. You know, 2 European wars. In 30 years, the world's going to destroy itself unless the United States takes over. So that's there. Then you have after the war two things. One, there's a very interesting book by a scholar named Frank Castigliola called Roosevelt's Lost Alliances, which argues that if Roosevelt didn't die in early 45, a Cold War would have been averted because he really got along well with Stalin and they would have been able to talk to each other. When Truman took over, that wasn't the case. And there was a lot of this is very in the weeds, but there's a lot of antagonistic diplomatic exchanges between 1945 and 1947 that make US policymakers view Soviet actions, particularly in Eastern Europe, particularly the ending of the so-called democratic interludes in Czechoslovakia and Hungary in a very negative light. And that's because there's this belief amongst the US elite that Stalin is in a meaningful sense comparable to Hitler, and that Soviet communism is very similar to Nazism, and that they're both totalitarian regimes. And that's a deeply felt belief. And I think the United States in the mid to late 1940s would have never been able to really trust Stalin. Only Roosevelt was going to be able to do that, and he died. Now, this is where I think the US has real responsibility for continuing the Cold War. I think once Stalin dies in March 53, and there's a debate within the Soviet Union about how to treat the United States, there are real overtures in 1953, 1954, and 1955 by Khrushchev and those around him to really end the Cold War. And this culminates, the apex of this, again, these are details, it's in the Geneva summit of, I think it's June or July 1955. It's the summer of 1955. And I believe that the Soviets came to this summit willing to make a deal. The problem was that the United States was so infected by the ideology of seeing communism bent on world revolution. Combine that with the ideology of primacy, American military primacy, is that Eisenhower and those around him did not take that event seriously, and they viewed it only as a propagandist, a way to make the United States look good in the world. And after that, you get the so-called Open Skies proposal during it of mutual aerial inspection of nuclear weapons. So I would say that there was a time between 53 and 55 when the United States, if it had a different perspective, could have really ended the Cold War. But once the Soviets saw that the United States wasn't serious about ending the war at the Geneva summit of 55, I think it got put on a track and was going to end. And was going to continue as a Cold War.
Yeah, and obviously in part, a lot of the in part, a lot of the escalations that were going on in the Cold War, supposed escalations, were in fact just national liberation movements that were fighting for freedom and fighting for dignity, and had mass support. Like Ho Chi Minh was definitely, at the very least, going to run a left-wing developmental states. But if the U.S. took a different tack in the Cold War, it might have been a non-aligned state with some vague Soviet sympathies, the way Nehru's India was, instead of this state that was firmly in a camp and had to fight, this to the death battle with U.S. imperialism just to survive. One thing where I will push back on here, it's not just if FDR lived, it's if he had picked a different. He didn't replace his vice presidential candidate, because my man Henry Wallace would have just put us in the Soviet camp, and we could have together with Comrade Stalin actually, decolonized the world. Maybe not exactly, but Henry Wallace was definitely the most left wing vice president the U.S. has ever had. It's kind of a low bar though. But let me get to some of these other questions. I guess there's one kind of getting at, not quite a contradiction, but one interesting thing where when I was having my talk with Mike McCarthy, and in his piece in Jacobin, the last issue, we were talking about how the particular role of the US dollar in the world economy actually is a powerful weapon for us, even when governing the US. Let's say if a Bernie Sanders type figure got into power and was administering a left social democratic program, how do we prevent capital flight? How do we prevent all these other tools of destabilization that have been used to thwart similar programs in other countries? Well, ironically, the central role of the US dollar as a reserve currency gives us some protection there. But this commenter, I actually lost track of the question, but the commenter was bringing up your New Republic piece, which made the argument that you had to reduce the dollar's global dominance to curb America's wars, to put it crudely. I was just wondering whether you could get into that tension, or maybe explain the piece and your argument a little bit more for the audience.
Sure. So I think that's right. What you just said. I mean, these are the tensions, because the dollar, the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency, basically allows the United States to spend whatever it wants on its military, and to do whatever it wants, to print dollars and to constantly build up its military forces with very little fear of being called on that in any meaningful sense. It also provides significant leverage over foreign countries, because everyone needs to essentially have access to the Fed. And so the United States, if it cuts off your dollar access to the Fed, then you're basically not able to function. And the nation has done this repeatedly with, for example, with Iraq. Right. Very recently, Trump threatened to cut off Iraq's access to the Fed, which would have essentially destroyed the country. And this was in the wake of the Qasem Soleimani killing the Iranian general. So I think that it's right that there are both these positive and negative aspects for a socialist politics of having the dollar as the reserve currency. And I think what we would need to do, and I was actually thinking about doing a bit more research on this, is to really map out the connections between American militarism and American economic power. I think this still remains an analytical sphere that has been largely kept separate. Some people are doing it. I think especially Nikhil Singh of NYU is really taking this issue head on. But I think there's a lot more analytical work before we're able to say, in these four areas we do this, and in those four areas we do that. But that's what a socialist foreign policy should be doing right now. I think we are going to be asking new questions in new ways, because we're actually critical of the empire.
And we also have to think about the role of politics in ways that are difficult. Like, for example, I used to be of the view that the Israel lobby didn't matter at all, because my instincts are a fairly orthodox Marxism. So I'd be like, okay, well, it's obvious that U.S. foreign policy and Israeli foreign policies are in sync, and the notion that U.S. foreign policy is this influenced by a small group of lobbyists just smacks of like the old anti-Semitic kind of rhetoric of the strings of world empire being pulled by a small cabal and whatever else. And obviously there's a materialist route to explain why the U.S. is so invested in Israel. But obviously lobbying does something, and obviously politics does something. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter. Otherwise that APEC is wasting a lot of its money and a lot of its time, going through those efforts, And on the other hand, we're wasting our time supporting the rights of Palestinians, because if the U.S. ruling class is so materially dependent on this relationship, then there'd be no point to the political dimension, if that makes sense. And I think that applies to a lot of these other questions of foreign policy. We need to figure out where is the U.S. acting in its direct material interest to secure certain markets and whatnot, and where is in fact this just statecraft being influenced by politics and by lobbying and whatnot. Because obviously it'll be easier to change the latter than the former, even before we kind of make these big structural shifts in how the U.S. operates.
And I would just add to that. I think that's exactly right. And so we got to take the politics seriously, and then we also have to take the technocracy seriously. It's hard to overestimate how much foreign policy is an elite-driven affair. It's really made by a small number of people who cycle in and out of it, very small number of institutions. And and I think the right wing, particularly the libertarian right wing on economic policy, has been very, very strategic, actually building on anarchist and left-wing history. If you actually read them writing in the 50s and 60s, but they've been very strategic about locating the pressure points and putting institutions and people in positions where they're able to push those pressure points. And so I also need to think, I also think that this is why the socialist movement as a whole needs to build what might be termed cadre that are able to do those sorts of things, as they're also democratically connected to the grassroots. So it's not an easy task, but it's one that I think the transformation of American foreign policy, absent some sort of Bolshevik style revolution, which I don't think is possible for a variety of reasons, this is the only way American foreign policy will actually be changed.
So I want to go back to the question of humanitarian intervention, because I'm with you. I'm a knee-jerk anti interventionist. I think you lay out a very good, simple logic for why that's such. If the US has the commanding power to be able to intervene in a swoop and bomb any country and put boots on the ground, to use that euphemism, in any country in the world on a week's notice, then there's a structural problem right there in and of itself, right? But obviously, we can admit that even though most humanitarian interventions have been a disaster, we could point to certain points in world history where there has been successful humanitarian intervention. So World War II, of course, the Allied intervention in World War II, whatever precipitated it, it had that effect. Same thing with India and East Pakistan. The Bangladeshi Liberation War, probably saved lives. Socialist Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia, dislodging the Khmer Rouge from power, definitely saved tens of thousands of lives. And even now, more recently, we've been in a very tough situation, or contradictory situation in the US left, for instance, as we advocate for the interests and rights of our Kurdish allies, as even some of our friends and comrades are actually fighting and volunteering, in the struggle for liberation against ISIS and other forces there, while at the same time denouncing U.S. intervention, U.S. involvement, alongside, of course, denouncing Russian intervention, Iranian intervention, and so on. But because we're based in the U.S., my emphasis has always been on, let's denounce the force we actually have some sort of control of, that we're part of the same, democratic polity, at least in theory. But obviously, that group was dependent on funding and weapons from the U.S. And when that U.S. Protection dissipated, we saw what happened with the massacre by Turkey. So what I'm saying is that there's all these sorts of complications. Does it make sense to just simplify this dilemma to say that in the micro instances, Western humanitarian interventions might save lives, but in the macro, it's going to lead to situations like Iraq. It's going to lead to the continued destable world order that creates more of these crises to begin with? Is that our response, or how would you respond to kind of the prodding around this issue of humanitarian intervention?
Well, there's a couple of responses. I think the large one is the one that I said, that structurally there's a problem if this is able to happen. Then I think the other response is, let's say Bernie won, and there's a population that's about to be killed unless you destroy the weapons. I mean, do the good humanitarian interventions, but don't do the bad ones. The issue is that I think in the short and medium term, as this apparatus continues to exist, and I don't think it'll be dismantled that quickly, is that you ideally have democratic connections to movements on the ground and think things through and maybe in some very specific instances you do them, but the problem is that they so often result in negative things. Look at Libya. I mean, pretty much everyone in the medium and long term doesn't really succeed. World War II, I would say, wasn't really a humanitarian intervention, but I think you emphasize that the effects were. But I think it's really difficult to do. The problem is, how do you like do the right ones while dismantling the thing at the same time? I think it's very difficult, and so our position should be one of extraordinary skepticism, and there has to be an extraordinary high bar before the United States deploys military power, even for humanitarian ends. And I would like to just say that we could also point to history and that in practice, um, ideas like the responsibility to protect, ideas like humanitarian intervention have often been the handmaidens of imperial practices. So in empirical history, sure, there's a few we could point to, Bosnia, we didn't intervene in Rwanda famously. That might have been a good idea to intervene. But in the macro perspective, they are not congruent with the socialist anti-imperialist project.
And also on the road to Iraq, we had lots of little step overs. Like for example, I've actually been in this doing this very unusual project for the past couple weeks, where I've been doing like almost 12 hours worth of interviews with this guy, Bernard Cord, the former deputy prime minister of Grenada, um, uh, and later imprisoned in part for his alleged role in the March 19th crisis that led to Maurice Bishop's death and other cabinet ministers' death, and then later U.S. Invasion. But it was those little events like Grenada, which, by the way, was obviously a crisis and part of the U.S.'s creation, and they were just gunning for an opportunity to invade a country to get over this Vietnam syndrome. And I think the Clinton administration was a big part of this too. The invasion of Panama, all these other cases were little small commitments of U.S. troops. I remember some of my first political memories in the 90s where you would watch the nighttime bombing of Baghdad with the CNN cameras, and you would see the flak and the tracer fire going up, and obviously not hitting any U.S. Planes. But all this kind of changed, I think, perceptions and at the very least normalized U.S. military power and restored it to some of its pre-Vietnam prestige, and that I think led directly to Iraq. Um, so, but obviously we need to deal with the world as it actually is, with multinational institutions like the United Nations that are super flawed. Jeremy Corbyn actually tried to grapple with some of this, and he's someone from, unlike Sanders, he's from a harder anti-imperialist left. That's not to say anything negative about Sanders, who of course was quite radical by the standards of mainstream U.S. politics. But Corbyn's from a tradition, probably closest to our own and to a lot of the people watching this feed. And he made an address to the on the occasion of International Human Rights Day in 2017, and he edited a version of his address, and via staff, we got it and we ran it on Jacobin in actually not March, December 2017. So it's called the Corbin Doctrine on our site if you want to check it out. But he's talking about the role of the UN and multilateralism and other things, which again might not be couched in the most radical rhetoric, but it's looking for these alternatives to U.S. imperial might in ways that I think are quite interesting, because obviously Jeremy Corbyn couldn't go out and say what he really wanted or believed, or he felt like he couldn't, which is like Britain should leave NATO and whatever else. So he's kind of looking for these intermediate kind of short-term demands that have that effect of reducing the power of U.S. militarism and U.S. imperialism. Let's see. We have a bunch of questions. Actually, I think we might need to keep it to maybe just one more because there are too many questions going in. I mean, again, people are asking about ISIS, about Rojava. I think we already addressed that with the last question. I guess there's a question about Bernie Sanders' shortcomings. So I guess we vaguely talk about Bernie Sanders being great, but having a few shortcomings in the direction of foreign policy. I don't like in general these lines of conversation because one, it's much easier for us as a far left opposition movement to have perfect politics than a politician that came within, like just inches of achieving the Democratic nomination. So I kind of like to celebrate Bernie Sanders on his own terms, and then kind of poke and prod rather than just say he should have adopted this or that rhetoric. But I guess if there was one practical thing you think Bernie Sanders could have talked about more, that would have not cost him a lot, but would have accomplished something, what would it be? Would it be talking more about foreign debt and how and that role? What would it be?
If I could have, I did. If I could have told Bernie one thing, um, I wish that he had discussed sort of the system. So I thought Bernie was really good, and mentioned in the talk, and sort of not just centering like I'm only thinking about the U.S. citizen. That's a really important move in the reality of global empire to do. I wish, well, two things. I wish that he emphasized the basing structure more, and talked about how we don't really need this thing anymore, that it's actually quite threatening to have 800 military bases when other countries have 30. Um, but the problem is that's not really a winning political issue. It's barely, on in the realm of the political in this country. And so I think if it was a major issue, he would have said that, but he didn't feel the need to center it. And then the other thing is, I always thought that the problem is he's right when as in he's correct when he refers to an authoritarian access. But the problem is in the actual history of US foreign policy thought, sort of dividing the world between good and evil has a very problematic, and I would just say destructive tradition. So I think Bernie was making the point that there's these sort of cabal of right-wing interests that are fighting against democracy and what we hold dear, and that's right. But the problem is you're still going to have to deal with Russia and China to combat climate change. And so, articulating, I think walking that fine path could have perhaps been articulated in a bit more of a coherent way. Although the problem is that that's incredibly difficult thing to do, let alone in a campaign when you're not exactly making very specific, you know, complex foreign policy discussions in the center of what you're doing.
And I think your idea that you brought up before, threat deflation, is so important. And there's a way to do it that doesn't make you sound like, the peaceniks that we all should be, and we shouldn't be afraid of that label. But merely at Bernie Sanders say we are the most powerful nation on earth, and we have X amount of like aircraft carriers. China has one. Like
Right.
just because Trump and the right will inflate the threat of Russia and China, the supposed threat, in just such ridiculous terms. And for most American people, even though I think for an empire, the US people are way less interested in an empire
I
than,
agree.
let's say, Germans in 1910s were interested in their African holdings in Tanzania, or the British average worker might have been interested in their, India and the British kind of dominions around the world. I think the American working class today is not so interested in those things. At least that's maybe my rose tinted
I think it's right.
view of things. But I think that idea of threat deflation is so important. And then ultimately, we want to push for peace. We want to push for support for international support for left wing governments abroad. Like, imagine what it would be like if you took power on a left wing platform in a Central American or South American country. And instead of worrying about the US, you could be like, oh, maybe I'll be able to call Bernie Sanders, and maybe I won't get this insane amount of aid, but maybe they'll relieve some debt. And maybe they'll help me secure that World Bank loan that we need to survive for the next year. Instead of the exact opposite, instead of being kind of this weight on you, one, the immediate demand is, of course, take away this weight, stop interfering and making life worse for these governments. But you could even imagine very mild things that the US could do, with a different sort of government, that nothing structurally is preventing us from doing it. Um, and obviously, that was a dream. It's been postponed at least a decade, maybe more. And obviously, in the meantime, we'll be protesting against war and sanctions and whatever else in the streets. But I do think it's worth thinking about what concrete policy on the inside can be pushed through these insurgent campaigns, like the Bernie Sanders campaigns and the future campaigns to come. And I really appreciate your work in Jacobin and elsewhere to this end, and obviously this lecture, which hopefully will stick around and be of use for years to come.
Thanks a lot, Bhaskar. I appreciate it, and I really enjoyed being on. Thanks for your questions, everyone.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a good night.